first of all, welcome to this gathering of members of the historic Fort Steilacoom and people who care about history. It's our honor to welcome Nicole Kindle here. I want to do a really quick preface, and I mean really quick. So this is the first time we at Historic Fort Steilacoom have done an in-person event since the pandemic. Nicole is here in one of the quarters that August Kautz built. And we could have done this the simple way and done this just through Zoom, but we thought it would be kind of amazing to have her here so she could speak in a room that Kautz would have walked in. And in fact, where Nicole is sitting is the office, would have been the office of his commanding officer. So this is the place where Kautz would have talked to, say, Lieutenant Colonel Silas Casey about the events of the day. So it gives us goosebumps to have her here and putting up so nicely with our slide projector that's beaming on her face every so often.
Hi, everyone. As Walter mentioned, my name is Nicole Kindle. First, I want to thank Walter and the Historic Fort Steilacoom Museum Association, or Historic Association, excuse me. Either way, I'm happy to be here. It's always gratifying that someone is interested in my master's thesis. It was a lot of time, a lot of tears that went into it as well. I have a presentation I'm going to share with you all today. As I mentioned, my name is Nicole, and this is a presentation on the many wives of General Augustus and Kitty. Sorry, my notes are a little out of whack here. Okay, now we're back in order. So several years ago, I began working as a research assistant on a project for the National Park Service at Vancouver Barracks, where I attended graduate school at Portland State University. While working on this project, this is where I first encountered August Kautz. I would come to learn that he was married many times, and his story, or rather that of his wives, really interested me. As I desperately needed a thesis topic, I began to research them more. August kept an almost daily journal, copies of which are maintained in the archives at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. While some of his journals have been lost over the years, and some years are not fully legible, I was still able to track his almost daily doings for nearly 40 years. The Library of Congress in DC, as well as other documents from the National Archives and Oregon Historical Society, provided letters, military orders, and scrapbooks that gave me further insight into his life and relationships with his wives, relationships that differed greatly, shaped by race, class, and societal expectations. In the abundance of resources, I was missing something key. For example, literally any primary sources from his wives. I wanted to research and write a thesis focused on a group of women, but I had no primary documents directly from them. They were mentioned in passing in journal entries and letters and interviews. This proved to be a barrier. How could I research, analyze, and write about women without anything directly from the source? This is a common problem when studying women in the 19th century and earlier, of course. August had both the education to know how to write, the time to make daily journal entries, and the financial means to purchase the materials to record his life. Journals, ink, and eventually a typewriter, which I am certainly thankful for, as it made reading his journals a lot easier. While these are seemingly trivial aspects now, they've had great impacts on the historical record and our access to women's perspectives, particularly for women of color during this time period. With that, I did my very best to find every mention and footnote I could about these women to try and understand the world they lived in and their relationship with August. And on this slide is just a list of some of the primary archives that I used when researching. And then those photos are pictures of the Library of Congress records. So they were housed in those blue boxes, and then the blue boxes. And then that's just the front of one of his daily journals. So a brief overview. August Valentine Kautz was born in Germany in 1828. He immigrated with his parents, George and Dorothy Kautz, to Brown County, Ohio. And that was in August 1828. And this is where he would spend the remainder of his boyhood in the town of Lavana, overlooking the Ohio River. In 1846, August joined the 1st Volunteer Brigade of Ohio and participated in the Mexican-American War. Upon his return to Ohio, he sought an appointment to West Point Military Academy. In attendance with him were many men of notable names from the Civil War, such as Philip Sheridan. After graduating in 1852, Kautz received official orders to Vancouver Barracks in Washington Territory. Kautz would join the 4th U.S. Infantry Regiment. Famous members include Ulysses S. Grant, who also spent a portion of his career at Vancouver Barracks, before eventually becoming the 18th President of the United States. August first visited Fort Steilacoom in 1853 for a brief visit. I was not able to discern from my research if this is when he first met Kitty, his first wife, or if this is when he returned in 1856 during the Puget Sound Indian War. Based on my research, though, I think it's safe to assume that they were married in 1856, but I could be missing something really important. And then in this slide are two photos that were found at the Library of Congress as well, kept in his scrapbooks from, it looks like two different, there's an actual photo and then a newspaper clipping, excuse me. August's first wife was Kitty. She was a Nisqually woman. And they would have two sons together, Nugan and Gus. When I first learned of August's wife, his first wife, she was called Kate. I quickly learned that was one of many names attributed to her, which would lead to many frustrations in tracing her story, even within August's own journals. He would call her Kate, Etta, Kay, or sometimes simply my friend. There are references to her as Tanas Puss, Kitty Etta, Just Kitty, and Ada. I personally struggled with what to refer to her as in my writing. I didn't want to be confusing and refer to her by all of these different names. So I found my answer in an interview conducted by Fred Lockley, dated 1925, with Nugan Kautz, their eldest son. Kitty and August's eldest son. He indicated that once she was married, she always went by Kitty Kautz. And so I chose the name Kitty to refer to her as, operating on the assumption that her son knew her well and knew what name she chose to be known by. Understanding her name was the first barrier in researching Kitty. I couldn't find any record of her birth, and I did find some census data from 1887 that noted Kitty was 45, therefore she was born around 1842, making her about 14 or so years younger than August. Her sons were also listed on the census data, and they were 29 and 27, making her 16 when she gave birth to Nugan and 18 when she gave birth to Gus. It was also incredibly difficult to trace her lineage, an issue that did not impact my research with either of his other wives. There are conflicting sources on who Kitty's father was. I came upon two potential fathers, Quymouth and Lashmere. The historical record is not clear on if these names were both associated with the same man either. What seems to be consistent among sources is that she was the niece of Chief Leschi, including work done by Sophia Spinth Carpenter. Carpenter was a Nisqually tribal historian whose work I relied heavily upon when researching the Nisqually tribe. August served as Chief Leschi's jailer at the Puget Sound Indian Wars and advocated for his innocence and his release. Chief Leschi would be found guilty of murder and executed on February 19, 1858. Kautz maintained scrapbooks of the trial and copies of The Truth Teller, a newspaper released during the trial to advocate for Leschi's release. While anonymous when it was published, it is now known that Kautz, along with William Tolmie and Frank Clark, published this newspaper together. This is, of course, only touching on Leschi's story and the injustice he faced. And in this slide is a photo of a piece of the scrapbook that August maintained. He maintained several scrapbooks that had articles referencing both Chief Leschi and his trial. Intermarriage between the U.S. military officers was very common with Indigenous women. So the settlers and the natives often, again, sorry, getting a little flustered. What I'm getting at is that intermarriage was incredibly common. It's just not really talked about. Initially, the British Hudson's Bay Company tried to prohibit intermarriage when the British arrived, but intermarriage formed alliances and created reciprocal economic and social bonds between traders and Indigenous communities. When the US military arrived, they too adopted this practice. While these relationships opened up economic opportunities and were initially reciprocal, they came with a price of violence and displacement when the relationships no longer served the settlers. I also want to note that it is common for communities to now ignore the Indigenous wives of the men who settled here and are now considered founding fathers of this region. As white settlers increased, more white women came to the region, and intermarriage was less acceptable and illegal for a period. August mentioned several of his friends and fellow soldiers who also had Indigenous families during this time, which means it was well known that both white settlers and military personnel were intermarrying. And here is an excerpt from that interview with Fred Lockley and Megan Kautz. During his time here, August was stationed at both both Fort Steilacoom and Fort Chehalis with his family from roughly 1856 to 1861. Over the course of these approximately 5 years, he and Kitty had two sons, Nugan, who he sometimes referred to as Luigi and Augustus, who we sometimes refer to as Luigi, and then Augustus, who he referred to as Augustus. So a very common problem for me as a researcher to have the same person being referred to by multiple different names. His journals only provide a little insight into his relationship with Kitty and his sons. With Kitty, he never wrote really anything to describe her, not what she looked like or his feelings toward her. He documented her disobedience and their physical altercations. Writing on June 1st, 1857, quote, "I had a row with my friend, but nothing serious, simply a little impudence repaid by a slap. And I went off depending more on a system of coldness to produce subordination than force." Again, on March 15th, 1861, spent the day in garrison. Nothing occurred except a small domestic row in which I came out winner. So he definitely saw and felt that Kitty was less than him in a lot of ways. And I get that a lot in his writings. Here on this slide is an excerpt from his journals. And then I kind of zoomed in on that particular quote. And yes, these are what all of his handwritten journals look like. And I did my best to read them. So I also have to say that it's very likely that I have missed references to Kitty and to his sons within this journal because it was very difficult to read. When he would talk of his sons, he would write about his hopes that they would receive an education and concerns when they are hurt. Here are a few excerpts posted on the screen, and I'll read a couple. Writing on September 6th, 1857, "Luigi is quite sick, his lungs affected by the whooping cough, and fear he will have a wretched time." He did also note the details of the birth of their second child. On February 9th, 1859, "A brother to Luigi arrived in this world today, about 3:00 p.m. The mother was out in labor more than an hour. I called in an old Lumi, but her practice of midwifery did not suit Kate, and I brought in Dr. Berrien, and in a short time after his arrival, the boy was born, who I shall call Docton in consideration of my numerous friends of the medical profession. The mother is doing well." I think it is important to note that while there are journals missing from this time period, he would go often weeks and months without mentioning Kitty or his sons. I also want to note that Kitty's relationship with Kautz and subsequently his relationship with the United States military allowed for her to have access to both a military doctor and a midwife. While we cannot fully understand her role and her autonomy in choosing Kautz as her husband, this relationship did provide her access to resources that would not have otherwise been available to her. August left Washington Territory and visited family in Ohio. He then traveled abroad. He left in April 1859 and made arrangements with his friend, Dr. Tolmie, to help take care of his little family. He ensured that they would be looked after financially and checked in on in his absence. August was back and reunited with his family in the Pacific Northwest by 1860, but he would not be there for long. Again, he documents his family's ailments, but it is noteworthy that he wrote about them more frequently during this time period. The outbreak of the Civil War called August back east, and this is the last time he writes of Kitty. This time when he left, maybe expecting it to be a little more permanent, he did not make arrangements for Kitty to receive money. Instead, he removed their sons from her care and placed them in homes of white families. While he does not provide insight as to why, it was common in this time to remove Indigenous children into the care of white male guardians. Again, the historical record is certainly lacking, but there are probate records from 1867 for Augustus Kautz that show his guardianship was under Edward Huggins and Warren Gove. His son, Nugan, was later placed in the home of Warren Gove. Nugan details his life after August left in an interview with Fred Lockley, and he explained that he lived with W.B. Gosnell from the time he was 7 to 14, and that he, quote, "milked the cows and fed the pigs and did the work of a man. But he desired an education and told his mother as much. In the same interview, he said, when I told her how anxious I was for an education, she sent word to my father and he wrote to Edward Huggins and had me taken away from Mr. Gosnell and put in charge of Captain Warren Gove, where my brother was. Captain Gove moved to Steilacoom. I stayed with him 15 months. During that time, I had 12 months of schooling." We can discern a lot from these few sentences. The boys were initially separated, they were in contact with their mother, and though there were no records of it, she could at least communicate with August in some capacity. And then here is an image of those probate records from the Washington State Archives. After leaving his Nisqually family in Washington, August returned to Ohio, where he met Charlotte Tod, who became his second wife. Charlotte Tod was the daughter of Ohio Governor David Tod, and as the daughter of an affluent politician, there was not much mystery to her upbringing. August and Charlotte met on December 19th, 1862, at a gathering at Governor Tod's home. He noted in his journal that night that the daughters are pleasant enough. One of them is pretty. Charlotte and August's relationship was sustained through letters during the Civil War, as August's military duties kept them from marrying until 1865. After General Lee surrendered in April 1865, August made plans to return to marry Charlotte. Then, President Lincoln was assassinated, and his plans were further delayed as he would be called to Washington, D.C. to serve on the trial of the Lincoln conspirators. While he had the choice to forgo his participation in this, he felt it was his duty. The military commission was established to put on trial the civilians that were involved in the assassination of President Lincoln, the attempted assassination of Secretary of State William Seward, and the plot to assassinate Vice President Andrew Johnson. The investigation found 7 men and 1 woman involved and subsequently put them on trial. Sentencing was passed July 6, 1865. 4 were sentenced to death, including Mary Surratt, who is noted as the first woman in history to be sentenced to death by the U.S. government. August did not report in detail the happenings of the trial in his journals, so we do not know his intimate opinions on the commission's findings, but he was one of 5 members of the commission that signed a letter to the president recommending a lighter sentence for Mary Surratt. Finally, August was free to return to Charlotte, and on September 14, 1865, they were married. August noted in his journal that the wedding occurred without any mishaps, and the gentleman indulged freely of wine in honor of the occasion. After they were married, August was ordered to New Orleans, much to Charlotte's dismay. She did not like being far from family and returned to Ohio often for visits. Tragedy would strike the couple. Charlotte contracted and died from typhoid fever on June 3, 1868, just after 3 years of marriage. Their union yielded no children, and Charlotte's death certainly impacted August deeply. After, August's military order sent him to New Mexico. 2 years after his beloved wife's death, he returned to visit her family, and he began to ponder remarrying. And at this point, he proposed to his wife's sister, Grace Tod. And on the screen here is her rejection letter to him. She responded to his proposal with, to me, what seemed like no concern for his pride. I do not reciprocate your feelings at all. Always have respected you and liked you more for my sister's sake than anything else. And besides, there's such a disparity in our ages. He was slightly wounded from this rejection, but it seemed that he was definitely open to the next chapter. And this letter was found at the Library of Congress. And I think we can assume that someone typed it and that it was previously handwritten. It says in parentheses there, signed. So I think that they saved it for posterity, which I'm very thankful for. Okay. So in comes Fannie Markbreit, wife number 3, August's third and final wife. She was born on June 24th, 1848 in Baden, Germany, to Leopold and Johanna Markbreit, making her 20 years younger than August. While I was met with confusion and, again, lack of sources for Kitty, it was really easy to trace Fannie as a family of a semi-prominent and influential white immigrant family. August even knew her half-brother. Fannie and August met in 1872 through mutual friends, the Conrads. Lieutenant Conrad and August were both officers in the military. August was put in command of Newport Barracks in Kentucky, and he was first mostly annoyed by Fannie and felt like she and Mrs. Conrad were being just a little too obvious in pursuing him as a husband for Fannie. He wrote in his journal in June 1872, quote, Miss Markbreit is still august with Miss Conrad. I find Miss M improves on acquaintance, but still she is far from being my idea of a woman. By the end of September 1872, Fannie had begun to sway his opinion, and August was, quote, debating very seriously the question of matrimony. August eventually proposed, but Fannie placed an ultimatum on his proposal, writing on October 10th, 1872, I met Miss Fannie at the Mercantile Library, and we had a long talk and some explanations. I learned a painful fact that the new love will not tolerate the old, and I cannot talk with her whom I love most now about her whom I loved most in the past. This is natural, but not without its pangs. The couple were married on November 27th, 1872. They had their first child, Austin, born September 12th, 1873, and shortly after set on their way to August's new assignment in Fort Garland in Colorado. and that they arrived there November 1873. This journey lasted just 8 days by train from Ohio, and then from the train to the fort, they had 5 wagons full of furniture and belongings, which included Fanny's piano. This was probably a stark contrast to August, when he had previously traveled to a western fort with just the belongings of a single bachelor. Fanny's priority at Fort Garland was to coordinate social events and enjoying the liberties of being an officer's wife. They hired the wife of an enlisted soldier to help with the housekeeping and the cooking. And August journals of this time reflect on him playing with his son, Austin. In contrast, he never actually documented playing with Nugan and Gus. So it was very interesting to see how he wrote about his children at the different stages of his life and with his different partners. The Kautzes were then transferred to Fort Whipple in Arizona. They visited Ohio before taking a 2-month-long trip by train, steamer, and wagon to reach Fort Whipple. Fort Whipple proved to be a very tumultuous time for August and Fanny's relationship, both with highs and lows. On one hand, they welcomed their second child, a daughter, Frances, or Frankie. She was born on April 11th, 1875. And then Fanny was also able to direct and act in the Fort Whipple Theater Group. Women's participation in theater at this time was largely unheard of, especially, respectable women. So having Fanny and the other officers' wives and their daughters participate was kind of largely unheard of and very unstudied at this time. I couldn't really find a lot of other examples of theater groups to compare and contrast to. The local newspaper, though, really praised the performances and noted how passionate Mrs. Kautz was. And this is an excerpt from one of those, one of the many, again, scrapbooks that August kept. But this one is pulled directly from the Arizona Miner online, but they certainly loved Mrs. Kautz's performances. By 1877, August was faced with dramatic unrest in the region. Civilians and corrupt government agents were fueling violence with the nearby Chiricahua Reservation, which caused a lot of tumultuous points for his career. Then in June 1877, Fanny delivered a stillborn daughter, who they would eventually name Lily. This loss deeply affected Fanny and was kind of the start of a strain on their relationship. After that, Fanny really yearned to visit home, and finally August gave in. He originally wanted to go back with her, but the military wouldn't let him. And so she went by herself. August escorted Fanny part of the way home, and then he had Lieutenant Anderson escort her the rest of the way, which was a decision he would come to regret. Seems that Fanny and Anderson may have had a romantic relationship. At the least, Fanny was certainly infatuated with him, and the news got back to August. A 3-page letter with a notation that it was never sent is dated October 12, 1877, detailing August's hurt regarding Fanny's behavior while back east. And I'll read just a quick excerpt from it. And then on the screen here is the first page of the letter. And again, this one has been typed after was most likely handwritten originally. So from the letter: "You could not have stung me more had you felled me with a blow than you did by that dispatch you sent me from there. I am still dazed with it, and I have suffered an age. My cheek glows when people ask me about you and want to know where you are and what you are doing. I feel as if I had lost all self-control. I can't sleep and have lost all ambition. I was not blind. I was not jealous when I saw that your preference was growing plainer and more manifest with each day of our journey. I trusted you implicitly. I did not believe that you would do anything to compromise yourself, and I thought the safeguards I had placed about you whilst you remained together would protect you. And as soon as you separated, I had hoped that vain fancy would pass away in the excitement of visiting your relations and old friends. I did not dream that within a week you would be planning, as your letters show, how you would be with him. And before you would have seen half your old friends whom you went to see, you would be with him, or how and what manner I have yet to learn." The whole letter, honestly, very juicy. But again, he didn't send it. So we really don't know what happened. His anguish and frustration at being stuck in New Mexico was really evident in his journals at this time, but he never directly mentioned Fanny's suspected relationship and infidelity. He was eventually allowed to follow her and went back to Ohio in November 1877, just a couple months later. And then transfer orders came for the Kautz family in February 1878. And this time they would be headed to California. They moved to Angel Island, which is near San Francisco. And after a few months, they were transferred to the Misha Barracks, 30 miles northeast of San Francisco. And this time, the couple really renewed their relationship. It was relatively quiet for August's career as well. Fannie tried to start a theater group, but there was very little interest. And this is potentially due to the proximity to San Francisco, which just allowed for more entertainment options. At Fort Whipple in Arizona, there was not a lot to do. The family also spent their time camping and enjoying the outdoors, and Fannie took to painting as well as hosting parties for the other officers and their wives. And in this newspaper clip this is definitely from one of their scrapbooks, comments on the fun parties that Fannie threw. And she definitely loved to throw a party, which was something that August very much did not like. He was seemed to be a lot more introverted. Fannie very much an extrovert. On July 14th, 1880, their last child, Navarro, was born and named for the river that the family would camp at. In April 1883, Fannie convinced August to let her and the children go on a trip. While they were gone, August obtained a typewriter and hoped to work on his writing in his family's absence. But instead, he fell into melancholy because he really missed his family. When they returned, he was overjoyed, and there was a stark shift in the tone of his journals, and he wrote about playing chess and backgammon with his son, Austin. In June 1885, he was then sent to inspect Fort Bidwell in Oregon, and then he took this time to give Fannie a tour of his previous posts and introduce her to his old friends. He also noted in his journal at this time that he arranged to meet up with his two eldest sons. He wrote on July 1st, 1885, "Nugent and Augustus came to the hotel to see me. They are well-developed men, and from all I can learn, are well regarded by all who know them. There is no if they met them or if the eldest boys met their younger siblings." As August neared the end of his career, he lamented his frustrations as he kept getting passed over for promotion by younger men, as well as his distaste in the political aspect of self-advocacy for promotion, as he thought it should be based on merit alone. Towards the end of his career, the Kautz family would be stationed at Fort Niobrara in Nebraska, and I'm not sure that I'm saying that right, beginning November 1886. After 4 years, he received orders on December 8th, 1890, calling him to Washington, D.C. And he was very glad of these orders, as the mounting tensions between the settlers, Sioux, and Army were growing. And these tensions would come to a tragic end weeks later on December 29th, 1890, in what history knows as the Wounded Knee Massacre. So Kautz missed being involved with that by mere weeks. And this is a truly tragic event in which U.S. soldiers took the lives of approximately 250 to 300 Sioux men, women, and children. And they were a peaceful group. And it is also notable that the exact number is unknown for how many were murdered. Kautz then reflected in his journal on December 31st, 1890, that he was grateful to have escaped being involved in the incident, and commented that all was done to instigate war, which he believed could have been avoided. August then spent the next few years in Washington, D.C., lobbying for promotion. Fannie would also participate, which really was against August's wishes. So he would ask her to not do it, but she would keep doing it. She would make influential friends, and then they would throw very extravagant parties, which exhausted both August and their finances. He was constantly writing about asking Fannie to withhold some of her spending and worried about his finances. But fortunately, all of that paid off. In April 1891, August received his final appointment, Brigadier General, and an assignment to Vancouver Barracks as the head of the Department of the Columbia. August would then return to the Pacific Northwest to the same post in which he started his career, and he retired in 1892. And on the left-hand side is a program from the farewell concert at his retirement party at Vancouver Barracks. His final years were otherwise uneventful. He and Fannie and the rest of his family visited Europe again. He came back a little bit sooner, and Fannie promised to stick to a very strict budget, but would eventually stray from it. This frustrated August, as he was forced to sell some land that he was hoping to save for retirement in order to pay for the family's return. When August returned, he spent some time in Washington, and he was trying to reconnect with his eldest sons. And in January 1893, he noted that they had reached full manhood. And while they are not what they might be, they are also not as bad as they might be. They seem to be making an honest living, and Gus has 2 children, and Nugan, one still living. He also noted that they were not very open about their affairs and only stayed an hour. So that's why I kind of emphasized that it seemed like he was trying to make a relationship, but they were not very forthcoming. And then after his family with Fannie returned from Europe, they spent time in Ohio with their Ohio-based family, using the word family a lot here. And then they settled in Seattle, Washington in June 1895. And then August would pass away on September 4th, 1895. So he was only there for a few months. His journal entries leading up to his death don't actually express any discomfort or anything more than general discomfort. So I don't think he really knew what was coming. But his death was attributed to his lifelong history of ulcers and digestive issues. But no other signs, except for the couple of days leading up that he had some heartburn. And then, so as I mentioned, he tried to reconnect with his eldest sons. There's no evidence to suggest that Kitty and August ever met again. As far as Kitty is concerned, we know that she married someone named William Diggins on July 3rd, 1875, based on marriage records. There's also evidence that she filed for an allotment with the Puyallup Reservation. These records indicate that Kitty was married to someone named Henry Walker. So it sounds like Kitty also had several husbands throughout time. It is unknown when they married or when exactly she died. Upon August's death, Nugan and Gus were not identified in his will, and there's no indication that they received any inheritance from his father's estate. During the Civil War, August put his friend Edward Huggins in charge of his estate with instructions to provide for his son if he died. There's no record of his sons, though, like I mentioned in his final will. It's hard to understand why. Maybe he felt he had more of an obligation to them when they were young, and he had kind of was faced with the mortality of the battlefield during the Civil War, and that maybe now, when he was older and his sons were older and had families of their own, he had less of an obligation. Or maybe he felt that Fannie and his children were more entitled to his estate. We can never actually know, though. What we do know is that the boys did sit down with Fannie after August's death, and detailed in a letter to Ava Emery Dye from Edward Huggins, quote, "Some shyster lawyers persuaded the 2 boys to claim their share of the general's estate. But after an interview with Mrs. Kautz, they, the boys, abandoned the idea of troubling her." So it seems that they potentially attempted to have a claim in August's estate, but that was never resolved from what I could tell. Nugan eventually married Elizabeth Olney, and they had 5 children that survived to adulthood. Gus remained on the Puyallup Reservation, where he married his wife, Maria. And allotment records indicate that they had 4 children: Granville, Emma, Kitty, Julius, and Ada. And descendants of August Kautz still live on the Nisqually Reservation today. Fannie and her children's lives were a lot easier to trace after August's death. Fannie never remarried and passed away at her daughter Frankie's home on August 11th, 1913 in New Jersey. That's where Frankie lived. Austin married Louise Hovey, and they had 1 son. Austin had a successful naval career that was cut short by his death in 1927. He was buried near his father in Arlington Cemetery. Frankie and Navarra lived long lives. Frankie died in 1962 and Navarra in 1970. The Kautz family provided me with a unique perspective on the colonization of the American West. I can only assume that Gus, Nugan, Austin, Frankie, and Navarra knew about one another's existence, as August did write about them freely in his journals. But there's no other indication from what I had access to that indicated they ever met or interacted with one another. August's choice in partners and his distinct family units created a complex and interracial family structure that proved an interesting case study in understanding how the colonization of the West impacted families. August, as a member of the United States military, was an active participant in the settlement of the West. He participated in the relocation of Native tribes to reservations and the resulting violence, while often critiquing the way the government acted. His relationship with Kitty, a Native woman whose autonomy and choices are unclear, was marked with physical dominance over her. And while we cannot be certain of how Kitty's life impacted her choices, we do know that she and her sons were forced to navigate their changing world. Fannie, as an officer's wife, participated in the spread of Eastern cultural values and as a result was an agent of colonization through her connection to the United States military. Throughout my research, I truly wanted to understand if love existed in these relationships, which also raised the question, can we possibly know that? And whose research on Indigenous wives of white settlers in the Pacific Northwest specifically noted in her work, quote, that she chose not to speculate on the emotions or motivations of the women she studied, as she was not of their time nor their culture, end quote. Historian Ann Hyde alternatively sought to answer those questions, but fully understood that, quote, historical questions about identity and love are only incompletely answered by the traces people leave behind them, end quote. As much as I wanted to understand the relationships August had with his wives, I could never get a complete understanding, as I only had his viewpoint, leaving this work largely incomplete and unfinished, which is often the disappointing reality when studying the history of women who lived in a time dominated by powerful white male figures. Thank you. So the question is, understanding what the allotment system meant. So from my understanding, and I am by no means an expert, when they were breaking up the reservations, individuals would apply for an allotment, so a piece of land, and that land would be their portion of the reservation, their piece of land. And so Kitty and both of her sons applied for allotments on the Puyallup Reservation, if I remember correctly. And so that was their place to live and create a home. Yeah.
And so that passed on to their descendants?
Yes, that's how it should work, is that it should pass down to their descendants. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Nicole, I'm interested in whatever happened to Lieutenant Anderson, who accompanied Mrs. Kautz and supposedly had a romantic relationship with her. I mean, you would think if Colonel Kautz ever found out about that, that lieutenant would have a very short career.
So the question was, what happened to Mr. Anderson? And when I tell you I tried to find out. I spent a lot of time trying to find anything else about the relationship, about him, about what could have happened. And there was just nothing. I'm sure there were several stones unturned, but I really tried to figure that out. And it came to a point where I was like, I have to finish my thesis. I can't keep trying to figure out what happened with that.
Well, just a comment, perhaps. I was struck by Kitty's letter that, or actually Kautz's journal entry about her giving birth. There was no reference to us or our, and he referred to her like in the third person as the mother. Mm-hmm. And that shows an incredible distance, mm-hmm. you know, from in the relationship.
Yeah. I'm not sure if anyone on the Zoom could hear that, but the comment was the quote regarding Kitty giving birth, that there was a lot of distance in the way that August referred to her in the third person, the mother. And that is a striking thing that I truly noticed in his journals when he would talk about Kitty and his Nisqually family versus his, his family with Fannie. And especially in the time leading up to him leaving Fort Chehalis to go fight in the Civil War, it was, he didn't mention them that much, but it was when he did mention them, a really stark contrast. He was very much distancing himself from his family in the way that he was talking about them, and not just Kitty, it was his sons too, but definitely with Kitty. And I don't know if that's maybe because he never considered Kitty to be, a forever wife, knew that he wouldn't take her back east. I'm not sure. He never expressed any of those sentiments. So it's just at this point, I can really say it's an interesting thing to note and to take into account how distant he was when he spoke with her, even in relation to giving birth to his son. Yeah.
Question about your process with the lack of a full historic record, which oddly enough never happens. If you could walk me through the process of making educated assumptions or Occam's razors, or you say, well, there's no record of that, therefore I can't make a decision either way.
Yeah, that's a really great question. So what I did is I looked at other officers of the time. I looked at their relationships with their children, specifically with Kitty and their children. I would look at what other officers with Indigenous wives and children were doing and how they interacted with them and their relationships with them. And, you know, like you said, there's just a lot of sometimes some educated assumptions that I had to make. August, I tried to, you know, stay as focused on what I had. So August quotes really fueled a lot of like my, you know, this is how he wrote about his children. He wrote, when he wrote about Austin, he wrote about playing with them, but he never wrote about playing with Nugan and Gus. And so not really, I guess I don't make assumptions, but I just, you know, highlight those key differences and then let other people make assumptions that they want to make. But I think it's just, like you said, researching what I can, looking at similar stories and comparing them and then making assumptions to get to a semi-informed conclusion.
Okay, well, I'll steal another question.
Yeah.
Do you think that there are records out there that would answer those sorts of questions, or just not everything was preserved for future generations?
Yeah, I think a combination of both. I think there could certainly be other documentation and other things out there. But I also think a lot of it, you know, is just lost. I think, you know, for example, that letter to Fannie regarding Anderson, I found that I went to Washington, D.C. in the summer of 2018. And I found that in the spring of 2019, sitting through all the letters. And I was getting ready to do my thesis defense in the summer of 2019. So, you know, it took me months just to find that letter from all of the records that I took, that I looked at in Washington, D.C. at the Library of Congress. And then for context, because nobody was there with me, when I went to the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., I only had 3 days to look at all of the source material. So I just went in there and spent 8 hours a day just taking pictures with my phone of every single paper, every single page that was there. And then when I got home, I uploaded them and then looked through them, which was nice because I got to reference them for several months and then zoom in to all those diary and journal entries that I couldn't really read. And even within the materials that I have, I'm sure there's information in there that I'm missing just because I can't read his writing. So yeah, a combination of definitely there's more out there, but a lot of it is also probably lost.
Well, Steve thinks of his next question. I want to ask one. What I got from your paper, and by the way, it's online, folks. If you Google wives, Kautz, Nicole very kindly placed it in the public domain, which is how we found it. Would you do this over again, knowing that there are no primary sources for the women that you so want to profile? Do you feel like you committed a valiant effort in a cause that had to be fulfilled? Or would you be like, I really wish I had gone after some people who had primary sources?
That is a great question. I think as much as I suffered through doing the research for this thesis, no matter what thesis topic I would have picked, I would have suffered through it. And I don't think, you know, that these women their stories would have been told if I hadn't wrote this thesis the way that I did it. Not to say that there weren't other stories out there that I could have told other women to research. So I guess to answer this, I don't regret it because it was interesting. It made for a very interesting, you know, path for me and complicated research project for me. But yeah, so I guess the answer is no, I don't regret it, even though people hear me complain about it all the time. So.